Welcome to Real News, folks. It's Mark Steiner. Great to have you all with us. As many of you may know, the Washington Post is releasing a 6-part series called the Afghanistan Papers, exposing the lies that were told not only to get us into this endless 19-year war, but lies told to perpetuate it, to keep the fight going, to lie to the public. It reminds me of the Pentagon Papers that Daniel Ellsberg released in 1971, showing the secrets that led to the widening of the Vietnam War and lies the public has been told to shore up support for that war. It didn't come in time to save the Vietnamese people who were murdered and killed, or the 50,000 of our own who died in battle. And these Afghan papers will not save those who have been devastated by the war either. Will they lead us to a questioning our leaders, to question why we go to war, to demand answers and change the way we operate this government to continue endless wars, wars without meaning, wars undeclared by the people of the United States? And we'll be producing a series of conversations about the Afghanistan Papers. Today, we welcome back to the Real News Iraq-Afghan war veteran, West Point graduate and writer, Danny Sojournson. He's the author of a memoir and critical analysis of the Iraq War called Ghost Riders of Baghdad, Soldiers, Civilians, and the Myth of the Surge. And on the heels of the Afghan Papers that were released, he wrote, I Knew the Afghan War Was a Lie, for Truthdig. And Danny, welcome. Good to have you back with us.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
So all this makes me think about the Pentagon Papers, the lies we were told back in the 60s that led us to the Vietnam War, that exploded this war, that affected all of our lives. The same lies are being told now. It's the overwhelming nature of how this establishment lies to us, the military lies to us, about these wars that were never declared. And then your piece was also so deeply personal because of the way the situation you were put in Afghanistan itself. So how do you tie these things together for us?
Well, you know, I had a sense, just doing my duty, just day to day, the absurdity of, democracy building in a portion of rural Afghanistan where we literally only controlled the ground we stood on. So we're talking about like a Vietnam scenario. I mean, my little outpost, which I commanded, we were basically under siege. Sometimes we were under attack within 50 meters of the gate. In fact, one time I jumped into a canal right next to my gate. That's how close we were to fire. But trying to build democracy or a nation build or protect women's rights in an area like that, something felt wrong. There was something viscerally wrong with it. So, as I read these reports, after 5 years of writing about this war, lots of research, lots of reading, plus my own experiences, I allowed myself the guilty pleasure for a moment to feel vindicated. But that only lasted a few seconds. And really, since then, I'd have to say that as a historian and a writer, I'm not surprised. And as a former soldier, I'm mostly saddened by these reports.
I mean, any war is hell, but the fact that almost every war we have fought, every war this country has fought since World War II has not been declared. They've been just done.
Well, that's just it. I mean, Congress has, completely turned its back, has been asleep on duty for their constitutional obligation to sanction war. And they just haven't done it. I mean, we're still using the September 14th, 2001 authorization for military force that allowed the Bush administration to go after al-Qaeda. I mean, al-Qaeda has essentially been gone from Afghanistan in any meaningful way since February of 2002, at the latest. So what are we doing now? How in the world can, 3 successive presidents, a Republican, a Democrat, and then whatever the heck Trump is, how could 3 successive administrations still say that the reason we're in Afghanistan, the reason young men and women are dying is because of an al-Qaeda-based authorization for force that was signed while the World Trade Center was still smoldering? This is a farce, and it always has been.
So let's take a look at this one piece from the Washington Post reporter talking to the Inspector General. And the Washington Post reporter quotes Douglas Lute, who's a 3-star Army general who served in the White House for both Bush and Obama, overseeing the Afghan war.
One of the most sobering things to read for me was just how many people involved in the war were very blunt and candid that the war strategy under Obama and Bush and Trump, they all said it was worthless. Doug Lute, General Lute, who is the Afghan war czar in the White House for 2 administrations, Bush and Obama. So this guy was, from the White House perspective, overseeing the war. And he's saying things like, we had no idea what we were doing. He said, I bumped into an even more fundamental lack of knowledge. We were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. And these are the people in charge of the war, essentially saying it was a disaster, and they knew it. But I don't see any of these comments in your lessons learned report.
As an inspector general, I don't do policy. What all you quoted were people talking about a bad policy.
That's the whole fundamental reason questioning why the United States is there. How could you let that drop?
Well, we didn't let it drop. I mean, the stuff is available. We're still producing these reports.
We just sued you twice to get our hands on it.
You know, when you have the man who was running this war for 2 presidents in the White House saying what he's saying now, and also had this inspector general had very little to say. I mean, how do you justify that? How do you justify men who put other men and women in danger and also destroy an entire nation?
Well, you know, I respect what Lute had to say. I mean, I respect his candor, but, you know, let's remember something. Lute was a retired 3-star general. This is not exactly a dovish peace activist, right? And he probably had more continuity in that war, overseeing that war, than almost anybody. But it was as recent as 2015 that he said, we don't have the foggiest idea what we're doing. That was when he gave that interview. And so my question becomes, well, if you knew that at the time, if you knew that late in the Obama administration or even earlier, I presume, why didn't you go public? Why didn't you resign? You have a 3-star general's pension. You probably have plenty of opportunity to earn in the Beltway with all of your experience. Why did not a single member of, you know, the 460 some odd generals and officials who gave these interviews, why did not a single one of them put their stars on the table and say no more? Because if Luke gave that interview in 2015, which is what I believe I read this morning, then more than 100, at least more than 100 Americans, to say nothing of Afghans, has died since that point in the war. And that's just disgraceful. I'm glad the Post put out these reports. I think it's important, but I'm also very disturbed by the senior leadership, both within my institution, the U.S. military, and within the national security structure more generally. This is a failure of leadership. And here's the thing, there probably won't be any accountability. If the CIA torture report, if any of these other, if the 9/11 Commission report, if any of these, you know, previous, you know, disclosures are any model or any judge, there probably won't be any accountability, but there should be massive accountability. I mean, mass firing. So we can get into that if you'd like.
Yeah, and it's mind-boggling in many ways how this kind of fell out. And I want to get into what you just said, but let's watch this piece now, I think, because it goes directly to this piece about what the generals did and what they didn't do, and the coded language that they used.
There's a clear pattern that what was said in private in these interviews contrasted so greatly with what U.S. officials, presidents, members of Congress, military commanders, what they had been saying in public over 18 years. Usually the talking points were all pretty similar. They would say the war is it's a tough place.
Conditions that are very trying.
It was a tough year.
Afghanistan, there's still fighting going on.
Increase in Taliban violence.
A higher level of violence.
But we're making progress.
Progress.
Significant progress.
You know, we're going in the right
We
direction.
are on the right road.
In the right direction.
And our strategy is sound.
I think it's important to understand that we do have a strategy that's quite broad.
That our strategy is succeeding.
So in some ways, Danny, this goes to the heart of what you and I were talking about just before we went on the air together, which was that how these generals had just lied to the American people completely and been part and parcel of the lies to the American public, and especially the ones who are in control now, and people like General Petraeus.
Well, yeah, we need to talk about that. I mean, that little clip you showed was really demonstrative, okay? The military loves words like turn the corner, light at the end of the tunnel. Those are Vietnam words. Progress, glide path. Those are the more millennial era global war on terror terms, but they're the same thing, right? But what we found out in the report is that many of the same people who you had on video right there, who the Post had on video, saying progress, 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 despite tough fighting and whatever other euphemisms, privately were saying that they knew all along it wasn't working. Okay, so that tells us that we have a national security structure that for maybe 19 years, going on 19 years now, has been lying to our faces. And in some cases, guys who were not necessarily quoted very in-depth in the Washington Post report so far, take Mark Milley. Mark Milley was chairman was Army Chief of Staff, and now he's chairman of the Joint Chief. Well, just a few years ago, he gave a glowing evaluation of how well the war was going. And within this very year, he said that it would be premature to leave and that this is not the time to talk about leaving Afghanistan. Now, that tells me one of two things, and I'm not sure which is worse. Either he is incompetent because he can't read the writing on the wall that the other 459 officials saw, which is that all the stats, all the measurable, waypoints are going in a negative direction, or he's a liar, right? Or he's willing to obfuscate and mislead and provide an illusion to the American people. He should be fired immediately on either case, but I wouldn't expect that to happen.
So, I should have said earlier that this is important to know that this Washington Post report was based on this study that was done by the Office of Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. It was called Lessons Learned. John Supko ran that, and the Post had 3-year court battle to get this information out, to make it public, to fight to make this, to allow to bring this out. So unlike Daniel Ellsberg, who actually stole this stuff and put it out there because no one else would listen to him, the Post went after this as a FOIA, and that's how this came out. The question becomes, Danny, the final thing I want to ask you is, so now what? What do we do with this? I mean, one of the things I posited at the beginning was, what does this teach us about what we have to do to control this process and not allow this to happen? It can just be another report that you hang on the wall otherwise.
Well, in this generation, it's very rare that these reports really see the light of day. And if they do, they're usually summaries. And if they do, it usually takes many, many years. I mean, I just recently watched The Report, right, on Amazon Prime about the CIA torture report under Dianne Feinstein's office. I mean, you just see how many years it took for this to see the light of day, how hard the government fought to keep it away. Now, what should happen is something in line with the Fulbright hearings on Vietnam in Congress, the Church hearings on CIA misconduct in the first 20 years of the Cold War, a 9/11 commission of sorts, and at the very least, the CIA torture study of sorts, but much more public, right? Much more public than the most recent two. I'm not certain that's going to happen. I don't think there's a lot of stomach for it in Congress politically. We're distracted by the impeachment circus. And I certainly don't think, despite some of Trump's occasional anti-war rhetoric, I don't think that the White House has any intention to really study this. And so what I am afraid is that this will be a blip on the radar. It will be yesterday's news sooner than later. We'll go back to the Trump, charade all day, every day on the 3 major networks. And I think part of the reason for that is the context for the Afghanistan papers is so different from the context for the Pentagon papers. People aren't out in the streets protesting.
Right.
There is no draft that affects everybody. So you and I could be concerned because you're an activist and I'm a disgruntled veteran, but we represent what? Less than 1% of the population? And so it's quite easy for my neighbors and friends and even family members in some cases to ignore this. And I think that's what the American people are going to do, unless every one of us bangs the drum day in and day out and does everything possible to keep this in the news, because it's probably the most vital story in the last decade.
I agree with you, and we're going to try to do that here at Real News. As a matter of fact, Congressman Ro Khanna has said he wants to start an investigation in Congress. We're going to try to talk to him next week, try to talk to Daniel Ellsberg, to compare this with the Pentagon Papers and others, and bring Danny back, of course, and continue this, because it has to be at the forefront. We're at a vortex now where we can maybe do something to build something to stop the madness that swirls around us. Maybe not, but we'll see. And Danny Johnson, and again, first, thank you again for your work and for always being out there in front, and appreciate you always taking the time for us here at The Real News.
Oh, I'm glad to do it, and I'll keep beating the drum, I assure you.
I'm sure you will. And I'm Mark Steiner here for The Real News Network. Thank you all for joining us. Let us know what you think. We're covering this a great deal more. Take care.
Thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it. But do us one more solemn favor. Hit the subscribe button below. You know you want to. Stay up on the videos.